thanks for joining us this early hour, and a big thank you to our hosts, the IDFC, the International Development Finance Club, and I think it's actually quite a good place to talk about adaptation transparency in this pavilion, because adaptation transparency is very much linked to finance and should be very much integrated with development finance. So I think we are at the right place, and I'm very pleased that we have been able to organize this event at this early hour. We are talking about the transparency of adaptation, which has not received as much attention as the transparency of mitigation, but it's extremely important, and that very much relates to the need to mobilize finance for adaptation. Transparency actually helps you to do good planning, to ensure that you monitor the progress in adaptation, and thirdly, to evaluate the effectiveness of adaptation measures. So all of that, if it's based on sound data, on good processes with effective stakeholder engagement, actually enables and facilitates the mobilization of finance, since it will be a strong argument for financial institutions to engage. And a side effect, of course, I need to mention that, is of course that it enables the parties to the Paris Agreement to report under the enhanced transparency framework as part of the upcoming biannual transparency report, which is just round the corner and due by the end of 2024. So countries need to get ready now in order to be able to fulfill their reporting requirements. So I won't continue. We have a set of excellent speakers, and I'll just briefly introduce them. We have here today Mr. Henry Neufeld, who is a senior researcher at the UNEP Copenhagen Climate Center. Henry works primarily on transparency and leads the adaptation component of the work under ICAT. And he is in charge of the adaptation gap report. Until 2017, he was head of the climate change unit at the World Agroforestry Center in Nairobi, Kenya, focusing on adaptation, mitigation, food security, and sustainable development in the context of agroforestry systems. I'm also pleased that online we have Dr. Sasha Naidu from South Africa. Sasha is a senior researcher in climate services at the Council for Science and Industrial Research, CSIR, in South Africa. She has extensive experience in the field of climate change, specifically in adaptation, monitoring and evaluation, technology needs assessment, and climate change policy assessments. And finally, I want to introduce to you Suruchi Badwal. Suruchi is a senior fellow and director for Earth Science and Climate Change at TERI. Suruchi leads research activities in the area of climate change, focusing mainly on impacts, vulnerability, and adaptation assessments, and works in close association with communities. She has been with TERI since October 2000 and has contributed and led several important projects. So with that introduction, I want to hand over to Henry Neufeld to give us an overview of the ICAT adaptation project. Henry, over to you.
Thank you very much, Henning, for this introduction, and thank you very much for having us here. It's a pleasure. I will speak about, we'll have to change. I will speak about the adaptation project under the Initiative for Climate Action Transparency, and talk specifically about two methodologies or guides that we've been developing at UNEP Copenhagen Climate Center, where I am the head of the Impact Assessment and Adaptation section. So the overall objective of the ICAT adaptation project is to strengthen the capacity of countries to plan, implement, monitor, and evaluate effective and efficient adaptation actions in a transparent manner for both domestic purposes and to meet requirements under the UNFCCC Paris Agreement. That's the overall objective, and Henning has already spoken about this, so I don't need to go into more depth. We work with all these partners here in 5 countries, and in these 5 countries, these pilot projects that we're carrying out, our partners are developing methodologies, national methodologies for domestic climate finance tracking. In India, work on agriculture and irrigation, and Suruchi will speak more about that. In South Africa, we have been developing, our partners have been developing multi-hazard early warning systems and work on impact and climate-related disasters, and Sasha will talk about that. Our partner in Kenya has been implementing the National Climate Smart Agricultural Strategy at subnational levels, an important element. And in the Dominican Republic, the work has been on agriculture and tourism. Our work at UNEP Copenhagen Climate Center has been about 3 methodologies: strengthening institutional collaboration in monitoring and evaluation systems, which is primarily an integration of national into subnational levels and the interactions with stakeholders that is necessary, information on how to do this. I will not speak about that. Methodological elements of assessing, monitoring, and reporting on loss and damage at the national level, and I'll talk more about that. And then good practice in adaptation planning, which is what I will start with. So the rationale for good practice in adaptation planning comes from the fact that current adaptation actions are really very, very poor. We've just demonstrated that in the Adaptation Gap report, where we assessed effectiveness of adaptation, and one of the key findings of that report was that adaptation action is woefully poor, and we know why, because of lack of integration with local stakeholders, short-term focus, that is, no consideration of future climate change, rebranding development actions as adaptation, which leads to incremental adaptation at best, and at worst to maladaptation, and also the lack of consideration of the underlying drivers of vulnerability. So these are really important reasons why adaptation practice is very poor. Now, if you can put yourself in the position of a country that is planning to implement adaptation actions, there are institutions, agencies that plan the implementation of these actions. So the work that this methodology is, the stakeholders we are trying to reach with this methodology are the civil servants that are in the position of making these planning decisions. And we want to provide them with skills and tools that help them make better decisions that enhance the likelihood of adaptation actions being successful. So if you put, again, this is the same what I was just saying, you know, proposal for an adaptation project then comes to the civil servants or the decision makers, and then they need to assess the proposals for this project and need to have the right tools in order to do this. And our guidance methodology addresses that section with the 2 arrows. The approach is based on an IPCC assessment, 6th assessment report, working group 2 framing, where adaptation solutions that are that work are effective, feasible, and conform to principles of justice. So from the planning to the monitoring and evaluation stage, of course, there's the implementation, but we don't know how our planned activities are going to work, and therefore we're breaking this down into potential effectiveness that hopefully then leads to actual effectiveness, feasibility that leads to implementation, and the anticipated equity and justice implications that we can then observe. So the methodology looks at different elements within these three different categories: effectiveness, equity, and feasibility. And if you look at the round bubbles: adaptation rationale, theory of change, monitoring and evaluation, ex post impact assessment, sustainability, innovation, and the potential for scaling up. These are elements that help us understand whether a proposed methodology, a project, will potentially be effective. And looking at that through this lens helps the evaluator understand the likelihood of a methodology being successful. And the same goes for the equity issues, stakeholder engagement, integration of vulnerable and marginalized groups, integration of local and indigenous knowledge, or gender considerations. And then in terms of feasibility, barriers, risks, the capacity of the organizations, and other elements that are critical to the successful implementation of actions. So if the project manager, the evaluator, will have a tool at his disposal, or their disposal, to make these calls without having the underlying knowledge, which is really the reason why decisions often are not good. So this is what the first methodology is about. It provides these evaluators with the tools to help them make better decisions. Now let me talk about our second guide on assessing losses and damages. The objective is to provide methodological elements for assessing climate change-driven losses and damages at national level. The rationale is understanding the challenges faced, the types of measures required to address these challenges, and the costs of these measures. And the target audience is government officials in developing countries. So here, the issue is that many developing countries face challenges when assessing losses and damages. Damages are those that where there are costs, economic costs and other costs, but they can be repaired. And losses are those things that cannot be repaired, in short. But it's really challenging to identify these things, and I will talk a little bit about that. The assessment is based on a large number of methodologies and publications that are underlying it. It also builds on the experiences of our colleagues in South Africa, and Sasha will certainly speak more to that. It also builds on, in terms of the damages, it builds on, also on a lot of information that's already out there. On damages, there is a lot of information out there, but it still needs to be structured. So this is pretty much what I just said. I don't know if you can read this. Adaptation at the top is what avoids impacts. But beyond the best adaptation, there is still residual impacts that might happen. And then when there is a climate hazard, they lead to damages and losses. And again, you know, what is reversible or repairable, that's what we consider damages. And what cannot be repaired or what is lost, that's losses. In terms of the dimensions that we need to consider in this context, we have the consequences of these losses and damages. We have direct and indirect effects of damages, for instance, but then also indirect effects in the economy when the impacts of a hazard then ripple through for instance, by losses of jobs or other effects that are not directly related to the impact itself. The focus, mainly the past, but then also the likely future in terms of assessments. We're looking at local and national governance levels, and of course, qualitative and quantitative assessment methodologies. And then we also need to understand and differentiate between extreme events and slow onset events. For retrospective assessments, we typically refer to two sources of data. First of all, those that are produced from national governments in the function of the Sendai framework, and basically refer to disaster risk reduction, and then other meteorological records that we can use to identify deviations from average climatic conditions. For prospective assessments, we need to take three steps. First of all, downscaling of climate change, climate projections, then estimating the future climate hazards, and then assessing the residual impacts, the potential impacts, and their connection to vulnerabilities and exposures. So when we frame the assessment for losses in this work, we have to understand that what losses determine really depends on the cultures, on gender, on the age, and other parameters. So it needs to be grounded in those that are going to be affected. So the definition of where one type of these losses ends and another type begins rarely is clear-cut, and therefore needs to be agreed upon with those stakeholders. And therefore the objective is not objective, but it really depends on the context. Finally, losses have different drivers, and we need to understand what they are in order to address or to some degree prevent future losses. To operationalize losses in this context, we assume that what exceeds adaptation, what exceeds the adaptation limits, that's what leads to losses and damages, in fact. And adaptation's limits are exceeded when we are deprived of something, and where something can be people, other creatures, objects, places, etc. And critically, these some things are connected to values which may value across communities, and therefore losses can only be assessed at the community and individual levels. The different categories that we consider here is human mobility and territories, cultural heritage and indigenous knowledge, human life, health and well-being, then biodiversity, ecosystem services that might be lost, and then also the sense of place and social cohesion. And this is basically how it's developed. We have these different categories like cultural heritage and indigenous knowledge, and break it down into different indicators that we can then assess. For damages, there's, as I said, there's a lot more out there, and I apologize when transferring this from my slide deck to this joint slide deck. Something happened with the fonts. And so different economic sectors need to be considered where losses and damages happen. And then just using infrastructure as an example, you can look at the impacts on the water and sanitation elements, power generation, transport, telecommunications. So you break it down into different subcategories. Indirect impacts of damages also, like gender differentiation, spillover effects, I already mentioned those, where damages then have ripple effects into other sectors or further down the line. And then larger macroeconomic impacts like foregone tax revenues, strained public finances, debt, etc. So these are the indirect consequences that also need to be considered when addressing damages. And then I don't want to go into further any details here. This is just about the different methodologies that we are considering in this work. And thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Henry. You really covered a lot of material in a short time. Thank you. A good overview. There will be an opportunity for questions, but we will first have the other presentations. And Henry was presenting as one of the methodologies under finalization, the loss and damage methodology. And we are now hearing a practical experience in applying that methodology. And basically that was also the source of developing the methodology from South Africa. And I'm happy to hand over to Sasha, who is with us online. I hope the connection is good. She's already on the screen. Sasha, over to you.
Good morning, colleagues. My name is Sasha Naidu. I'm a senior researcher in the Climate Services Research Group at the CSIR, and I'm based in Durban in South Africa. And I'm also the project lead for the ICAT Adaptation project in South Africa. So CSIR is leading the project with the Department of Forestry, Fisheries and Environment. And we thank you for the opportunity for us presenting on our experiences in developing the M&E framework for losses and damages. Next slide, please. Next slide. So the purpose of the presentation today is to basically highlight what's being done in terms of loss and damage reporting in South Africa, unpack who's involved in this process and what the challenges are, and also illustrate the framework that we've developed and its practical application. Next slide. Our country's National Development Plan provides the long-term vision for the country through its program to advance economic transformation through development planning. We also have the medium-term strategic framework, which highlights the need to reduce the impact of climate change disasters on human life, livestock, crop yield, houses and shelter, infrastructure, biodiversity, and the environment. There are currently limited structured tools, methods, and data collection systems in place to guide the country in its approach to monitoring the evaluation of loss and damages on human lives and economic factors as well. So developing a baseline for the assessment of losses and damages was the genesis for conducting this work under the ICAT project. There is a need to have a system in place to help the country better monitor and evaluate the impacts of extreme weather and climate events. Next slide. The work has two objectives. One was to evaluate how reporting is done domestically and identify the gaps and access databases to provide the available data. And the second objective was to develop guidelines for a framework to monitor and evaluate the impact of weather and climate-related disasters to support the M&E of climate change in the country, and also to serve as a guideline that can be used by other countries. Next slide. So the approach that we took was to review the frameworks to understand how the criteria are measured and defined, and understand what data is required and what the roles and responsibilities of those involved are. We also had extensive stakeholder consultation where that informed our work in terms of input from stakeholders and also getting insight while we were developing the proposed framework, and also to source available data on losses and damages and costs of impacts that had been reported based on historical data. We also wanted to identify what challenges there were in terms of data funding and institutional capacity, and using that information, then develop a framework to guide our reporting on losses and damages. Next slide. Next slide. So the information and data that we collect in South Africa on declared disasters are usually collected, managed, and curated by the government sector. National and provincial government departments national and provincial disaster management centers get this information from local government. Usually it's for disaster recovery and relief support. So the national and provincial government sector departments also collect disaster-related data for monitoring and reporting services. So the private sector, civil society, and research organizations, they also engage in collecting similar types of data. However, access to this data can sometimes be limited, and there's a need for more public-private partnerships and collaboration on disaster research. Next slide. So there are several databases which range from the government and research academia and the private sector, and these are distributed between the National Disaster Management Center, the South African Weather Service, Statistics SA, municipalities, the government sector departments, and the insurance industry, to name a few. And this information then has to feed into the country's climate change response monitoring and evaluation system. Next slide. Next slide. So there are many challenges and interventions needed when it comes to data collection and reporting. And this is, again, related to the actual data, the funding of this data collection and having a database, and also in terms of capacity. So there are data gaps and scale inconsistencies and lack of metadata across these various databases. And there's a need for best practice guidelines on data collection methods and preparation of data. There are differences in reporting in terms of your hazards. So there's differences in how hazards and declared disasters are reported. And there's also a need for better coordination among role players to aid this loss and damage reporting. And also there is limited funding beyond a prototype level. So, and also in terms of beyond a project lifespan. So there's a need to integrate the loss and damage framework into existing reporting structures, also to avoid duplication and not have reporting on various platforms, so they all feed into a central database. Next slide. Next slide, please. So our team in the ICAT project, we've developed a draft framework for the monitoring and evaluation of the impacts of climate and weather-related disasters to serve as a guiding tool to systematically record human and economic loss data arising from meteorological, hydrological, and climatological related disasters. So the data is collected from diverse sources on human and economic impact, and this is done using the Sendai target impact indicators for targets A to D. And the data is then recorded and processed according to a defined methodology for recording, and should also be quality checked for accuracy, and then aligned to the existing systems of the SA Weather Service and the National Disaster Management Center. Then this process of data collection and reporting is aligned or will be aligned to the South African monitoring and evaluation system, which can then be used for international reporting and also national reporting. Next slide. Next slide. So the loss and damage framework may be integrated and aligned with the current monitoring and evaluation system. And as I said before, this is to minimize duplication of reporting and also ensure optimal utilization by end users. Then what the intention is in integrating this as part of the existing system is then also we have further improved data collection through a process of feedback and learning as time progresses. Next slide. So the loss and damage framework will support stakeholder coordination, building on existing databases, and promote coordinated and enhanced action across climate change adaptation and disaster risk reduction. The framework will support tracking what the country is doing in terms of the medium-term strategic framework target, and also support fulfilling the country's reporting requirements. Next slide. So in terms of where we are currently and the next steps towards finalizing this work, the Excel-based tool that we have developed so the team has developed an Excel-based tool, and this will be used to illustrate the proof of concept for reporting of the framework. We are currently in the process of finalizing the tool through improving the functionality for the end user. Thereafter, the tool will be accompanied by a best practice guideline, which will serve as a user guide for using the tool and also inform planned stakeholder consultations and training workshops to support capacity building and transparency in reporting on the impacts of climate and weather-related disasters. Next slide. So thank you very much for your attention, and let me hand over back to the team in Egypt.
Thank you very much, Sasha. And please stay online if you can. We will take questions after the next presentation. And with that, I will move to agriculture, and we'll hear experience from India. And I'm pleased to hand over to Suruchi Badwal from TERI to share her experience on developing a national framework for adaptation for agriculture.
Thank you, Henry. I'm Suruchi. I work with the Energy and Resources Institute, and I come from India. And our engagement with the ICAT initiative is with regard to development of the National Monitoring Evaluation Learning Framework for the agricultural sector. To begin with, basically, I thought I would just put some thoughts with regard to why are we working on the transparency initiative and how do we see it connected to many of us who come from the developing world. So what is the need for transparency in reporting processes? And I think some of the points that, where we connect with regard to the work that ICAT is doing is with regard to, providing updates to progress on mitigation and adaptation. And it's very crucial because I think when we're talking about climate action and work related to mitigation and adaptation in countries, there is a need to basically see what the progress of work is with regard to the implementation in both of these areas. And therefore, these frameworks and tools would help countries report on the progress with regard to work on mitigation and adaptation in many sectors and within different areas. Identify the barriers and gaps, if any, that could be considered in the process. So while we are mitigating and adapting, we do understand there are many challenges in developing countries with regard to the implementation processes, and that's very well known. There are already development gaps that we experience, and therefore adaptation gaps are yet and normal in our countries. And therefore, we need to understand what are those barriers and gaps to these processes of, the tools that are being developed and the frameworks which may help identify possibly the capacity gaps that exist within countries, the institutional gaps, the infrastructural gaps, and the gaps with regard to lack of resources to be able to implement many of these actions effectively. Of course, it would also contribute to the country's NDCs in terms of reporting on the progress with regard to many targets and goals that have been set, and in turn basically contribute to the global stocktake process that countries have to basically contribute. It would also lead to compliance with the overall goals of the Paris Agreement, and also build on the limited understanding on transparency and reporting processes with regard to adaptation. So mitigation, to some extent, I think some work and maybe considerable amount of work has already progressed, but adaptation is one area where, of course, Henry highlighted in his presentation on the complexity and the challenges with regard to reporting processes. It's not going to be very easy. Of course, it's very scattered. There are various actors involved, and of course, different scales that basically we are talking about adaptation and its implementation. So just to go back to India and the country spread, it is one of the largest, 7th largest countries in the world, and possibly now soon going to be the most populous country in the world. Its landscape is quite spread out with coastal regions, mountainous terrain, northern plains, a plateau region, and islands and deserts. So it's quite a varied landscape that the country holds. And it relates very closely when we're talking about adaptation, because no one fit kind of an arrangement can basically be used for uh, you know uh, other part of the country, because it's so varied in terms of closer. Okay, so it's so varied in terms of landscape and the spread of the landscape across different parts of the country. It's got diverse geographies, and therefore with the diverse geographies are the diverse climates that the country holds. The northern part has a very different kind of a weather a context compared to the coastal regions, compared to the mountainous regions, where we see stark differences in temperature patterns and also rainfall patterns within the country. So one fit adaptation solution cannot be applied to the whole country, and therefore you need to contextualize when we are looking at adaptation actions and implementation within the country. The northern part of the country has a continental climate with hot summers and cold winters. The coastal regions are basically warmer temperatures but more equable climate, and there is a stark difference between the summer temperatures that we experience in the coastal regions and some of the northern belts compared to the mountainous regions that we have in the country. These are certain observed trends in changes with regard to the climate that we are observing with regard to temperatures. We've heard it all over. There are changes that we all know that are being experienced with regard to temperatures. We also have records with regard to increasing trends of temperatures, maximum temperatures increasing at a much higher rate compared to the minimum temperatures. And of course, there's a difference between the high increases that we see during the post-monsoon season followed by the winter season. Rainfall patterns, historical trends in terms of changes have been observed, influenced by many factors, because I think Asia is a unique region where we experience the monsoons, and therefore the ENSO phenomenon, the influence of the ENSO to the monsoons, but also the influence of an enhanced climatic condition parallelly to the ENSO and other interconnected connection factors that influence the monsoon, basically affecting the monsoons over the region. We have been experiencing extremes which have been on a rise. Floods and flash flood conditions have suddenly increased in the past 2-3 decades. Just this year, 2/3 of the country actually has been affected by floods. Therefore, the nature of these extremes have increased, and we are realizing the impacts of climate change in a very drastic way. Also, heavy precipitation incidences and linked landslide events, etc., are some of the events that basically the country is grappling with in the current day situation. And of course, with climate change over the years and how basically changes occur, these events are likely to multiply by the years. So there is a need for adaptation, and India is one of the most vulnerable countries. It's highlighted as one of the, it's highlighted as 7th on the Global Climate Risk Index. Impacts are being felt. I've already said all sectors are likely to be affected, and the agriculture sector is highly vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. The impacts on the Indian monsoons are going to have a direct impact with regard to water availability, but temperature sensitivities and increase in temperatures are also going to have an impact on the agricultural sector. Besides the fact that the impacts on pests and diseases and the damage to crops is another important factor that needs to be considered with regard to impacts on productivities and production of crops. Right now, India is a food secure country. It basically is able to produce food for its own people, the 1 billion plus that we house, but we are also one of the largest exporters of many crops to the world, including sugar. And I think an impact on agriculture is likely to have a great impact with regard to overall production and food security concerns, not only for India, but also the world. Priority sectors, I'm sorry you can't read what is there in the box. I think it's agriculture, water, and livelihoods. These are all interlinked to each other, how water impacts agriculture, and of course, there are 600 million people in India who are dependent on agriculture and therefore affected because of the impacts. This is a study talking about how rice, wheat, mustard are likely to get affected in India with regard to overall production. Now, India approach for ICAT is basically to understand the diverse ecological landscape that the country has and corresponding climate challenges posed in the agriculture sector, and use basically an approach which is a bottom-up approach for understanding the local context and the implementation processes of adaptation, and through those learnings basically develop a tool and framework that can be scaled up at the national level for implementation purposes. So that's the approach that basically we have used in India with regard to implementation. This is basically the need at the national level to basically develop such tools for monitoring purposes. I will just skip this, and we have used a bottom-up approach, and we've used the approach to scale it up at the national level. So what are we doing to scale it up at the national level? We did 3 case studies at the subnational scales, took learnings from the actions, adaptation actions that are being implemented at the subnational scales, focusing on agriculture and water for irrigation, and then basically doing a review at the national level to see what are the national agricultural initiatives, policies, programs of the government of India through both development and focused on adaptation to help basically report on progress with regard to contribution to reduction to climate risks. So there's a list of various programs and policies that we have in the country with regard to focus on basically addressing some of these concerns. It's basically the National Mission on Sustainable Agriculture, the Rainfed Area Development Program of the Government of India, the Submission on Agroforestry, the Krishi Vikas Yojana, which is the Agricultural Progress program, and then of course things related to the irrigation schemes of the country, the insurance schemes of the country, the extension and advisory schemes of the country, and schemes with a focus on promoting, marketing, and development of diversifying agriculture to horticulture and other areas. So there are several schemes that we have which basically are being floated within the country, by way of which, of course, implementation is being promoted for strengthening the case for adaptation. Now, these are the steps that we've basically followed in terms of the overall look of our national framework. We have taken key learnings and takeaways from the subnational scale interventions. We have scaled it up for the development of a national level MEL framework. We have tried to align the MEL components with practice and policy in India, and had consultations at the national level and subnational level with a range of stakeholders to help build on this process, and therefore develop the approach for the tool and the framework that is being developed. We are in the process of finalizing this framework that we are developing at the national level, which basically looks into different areas with regard to reporting on progress in the agricultural sector. One, with regard to the biophysical progress of work that may help reduce the risk to climate, which is closely related to promotion of climate resilient cropping practices, water management and water efficiency in agriculture, and also linking it to soil health management. On the socio-cultural side, linking it to livelihood diversification and indicators for livelihood diversification through the various programs and schemes that are being implemented, incorporation of organic and traditional farming practices that may help strengthen the process of adaptation, and reporting on progress with regard to that. That on the technological side, basically looking at innovation and updation of agricultural practices, and looking at digital solutions and ICT-based solutions that can be used for faster reporting and monitoring of progress. And on the economic side, with regard to post-harvest value addition, with regard to just not focusing on the one product, at a stage, but also looking at the value chain with regard to the reporting progresses, and in terms of development with regard to reduction of damages, improvement in market linkages that may help in terms of improving incomes and overall economic situation with regard to the incomes of farmers and contribution to the economy. On the financial side, increased financial inclusivity of farmers in various processes, and also insurance and credit mechanisms that we can think of, that we can basically provide to the farmers. It's just the way forward, the last slide, which basically says that we are in the process of pilot testing the indicator-based framework in certain locations of the country. A strong component of the development of the tool and the framework basically entails capacity building. So the objective is, once the tool and the framework is developed, is to have several capacity building exercises with national level stakeholders, but also sub-national level stakeholders, to understand how the tool can be taken forward in terms of its implementation. I think without that, we would not be able to achieve what we started off with, because we do want to have people basically use this tool and framework for implementation and consider it in their regular reporting processes, so that whatever data then gets collected through this process helps in the processes that I outlined in my first slide with regard to India's reporting for the NDCs or the global stocktake, and or for the compliance of the Paris Agreement. And of course, taking the learnings from each of these to advise policy decisions and develop other frameworks for other sectors and focus areas. With that, I'll just close, and if there are any questions, I'll be happy to take them. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Suruchi, and thanks to all the three speakers for squeezing into short presentations a lot of material and a lot of rich work. And I want to use that to tell you that, of course, all these will be reflected in reports. The methodologies will be up in the coming weeks on the ICAT website, and reports on each of the country experiences will also follow in the coming months. So if you want to look back on the snapshot that you just got and see some of the details, then please follow up on our website. But we have a couple of minutes left for if there are any questions now. So can I see whether the room that has been filling as we were speaking, there are questions. I see already three. So I think you were first, if I can invite you.
Thank you very much. My name is Edmond Kangamgaze, coming from Zambia. I'm interested in the first two presentations. So if you look at issues of loss and damage, one of the issues that has always come is the aspect where you have non-economic losses. For instance, losses of culture, villages, broken families, talk about grave sites. How are you going to cost this as a loss, or is this the damage? I'm not sure. You're defining what the loss and the damage is, but how are you going to cost this in the methodology? Yeah.
Thank you very much. Those are, I would say, questions for Henry and Sasha. Let's collect the questions and then respond together. So.
Thank you. My name is Esther. I think mine is related to his concern. I was also wondering, because operationalizing losses, you said it's connected to values. So whatever I value, maybe somebody else is not valuing it as a loss. So I was wondering, what tool do you use to have that measured? Thank you.
Thank you very much. And the last question here.
Hi, thank you very much for the presentations. My name's Justin Goodwin. I'm from the UK. I'm a transparency expert, also working with ICAT on some guides and also some regional hubs. I've come to transparency via mitigation, but increasingly realize that the process for dealing with gathering good data and using it to inform stakeholders is quite a standard, common approach. So I'm interested to see, you coming from the adaptation side, how much we can learn from each side. With the mitigation, we've got more of a reporting mandate, which focuses minds. With adaptation, we haven't, but with adaptation, I can see we need data, and we need to engage stakeholders even more than we do on mitigation. So I'm interested in this cross-cutting approach and what you think about merging mitigation and adaptation from a transparency perspective.
Thank you very much. So those are quite some questions. We don't have that much time, but I'll hand over first to Henry, and then Sasha, you may want to come in on the loss and damage, and I think see what you can contribute on the general question from Justin.
Thank you very much. I think these are three really relevant questions you've asked, or 2.5 questions maybe. So on the valuation of losses, non-monetary losses, how do you do that? And, we do not go to the point where we say what it is. I mean, the report, the methodology does not provide you with the answers. You have to find the answers. What it does is provide you with the information and sort of the tools to come to a conclusion what the values are. So if these value-based losses, you just mentioned graveyards, or due to sea level rise you lose your land. That might be an easier case, but where it is different between values in terms of the losses that you faced, it is a national, subnational dialogue that relates to these values. And again, this connects to the question of bringing in stakeholders into the process. My understanding really is that from a national perspective down to the local level where the impacts are taking place, you need to have this multi-stakeholder dialogue on platforms, some forms of engagement to enable the different stakeholders to be heard and find a process that enables these stakeholders' values to be considered. And then this is really a process of deliberation, negotiation, and ultimately somebody's going to have to take a decision, and that is normally the national level. But if there is a process in place that enables genuinely the participation of stakeholders at the local levels, subnational and then local levels in particular, then there is a high probability that these different value systems can be engaged and incorporated into the national framework for assessing losses and damages as well. And this is, I think, where it also cuts across to mitigation, because the process on the ground really is very, very similar. This is basic. It's not only adaptation. It's not even only mitigation. It's development. It's general planning. You need to have local engagement and stakeholder participation to ensure co-ownership and buy-in, and also to identify different values, different reasons why stakeholders engage, and therefore identify preferences and losses. And there's winners and losers in every process. Let's think about investment and mitigation actions that they might be planned at the national level, but they have implications at the local level, just to mention the NIMBYs that will have to deal with a power plant, solar energy, or wind energy facilities in their vicinities, and that has effects on the housing costs, etc. So wherever you are, when it comes to implementation, you need to have this strong participation of local stakeholders of all levels, at all levels. And therefore, what we do in adaptation, I think, is to a large degree transferable also to mitigation actions and transparency. I'll stop here and hand over to Sasha. Thanks.
Yes, Sasha, I hope you're still with us and you were able to listen to the questions. If you can give some practical insight into that valuation question, I think that would be really useful for the audience here.
Yes, thank you, Henning. So yes, thank you for the question. We do also think it is important to look at non-economic losses, but at the moment, our first step is on reporting and developing our reporting foundation. So the focus is on things that we can quantify, and there's available data for it. So we are looking at the Sendai targets and its impact indicators, targets A to D. And so that basically covers the human and economic impacts. So the number of deaths and missing people, damaged and destroyed buildings, and then the direct economic damage as well as destroyed infrastructure. So the reason for us taking this approach, one is in terms of data availability, illustrating our proof of concept, and also facilitating standardized reporting when this framework is used for each of the hazard events. So while non-economic losses are important, I agree with Henry. Once we have our baseline and the reporting framework, then we can inform our non-economic losses from a country perspective, but also from a local perspective, using insights from stakeholders in the various municipalities. And then this will be done as part of the consultations. And will be part of that learning by doing process where we can then seek to further improve the framework that we've developed. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Sasha. And over to Suruchi on either of the questions, please.
The last one with regard to the linkages on mitigation and adaptation. And of course, Henry mentioned that on the adaptation side, of course, the data is weak and it needs to be built. It requires a lot of stakeholder engagement and inclusive processes to be included, right from the national to the subnational and the local scales. Just giving an example from the agriculture framework that we are developing, and what we're realizing when we are looking at the framework and the development of the tool, while there may be direct indicators for measurements on the adaptation side that would be developed, but there are many on the mitigation side also, talking about the agricultural sector, soil health management. Of course, it links to somewhere with regard to even emissions, with regard to the condition of the soil, agroforestry, and then organic agriculture, promotion of organic agriculture. So we do see when we are looking at indicators, they are just not restricted to reporting on how it may help address adaptation, but it also has kind of a mitigation connotation on the co-benefits side. So, so yes, those linkages definitely can be weaned out, and we will be doing that while we are developing the tool and the framework.
Thank you very much. We don't have time for another round of questions, but I want to thank the speakers and the audience for joining us here this morning. And I am sure you've got a good impression of the work that's emerging. I think it's important to understand that this is very much linked to very practical experience on the ground. And besides the two countries we heard from today, India and South Africa, we have also Bangladesh, Kenya, the Dominican Republic and Panama connected in the ICAT adaptation project. And all this experience is coming together and the basis for the methodologies that are being finalized right now. So this will be available very soon, and we do expect that it can give countries very clear guidance and help in moving forward. The challenges, of course, lie in the details, and you will experience them once you get started. But if you don't get started, you will not make progress. So I'm encouraging all countries to start engaging on this subject. Use the methodologies, give us feedback. ICAT is available to support these efforts in countries, and that's why we have had the work on developing the methodologies. They will be refined, I'm sure, after several rounds of applications, and it is a process, as Sasha outlined, of learning while you do implementation. It is certainly not a good strategy to keep waiting until the perfect methodology emerges. You have to get into the practicalities. ICAT has just opened a call for countries to express their interest in joining the initiative. So if countries have now some interest in working with us, please let us know. The call for expressions of interest is up on our website. Deadline is 15 January, and we would be happy to hear from you And of course, the team remains here, and we can also be contacted informally. So thank you again to the speakers, Sasha, Henry, and Suruchi, and let me invite you to a big applause to them. Thank you.